Hello there and welcome to another Pyro seminar. This is the third part of a kind of Pyrotheology in practice. And so what I did in part one is I looked at the practice, but like what it's trying to do, what the structure of the practice of Pyrotheology is. In part two, I looked at transformance art and looked at what it looks like, how do you construct a gathering, etc., etc. And now I want to do decentering practices. And the idea for these three seminars, of course, is I'm wanting to inspire you to do something like what I'm talking about. It might be quite close to what I'm talking about. It might kind of, your brain might be sparked with some ideas and you'll take things in a different direction. But, I really want to encourage you to see if you think that something of what I'm talking about could be of use to you and your friends and colleagues and your community. So we've done transformance art. I'm sure I did cover this, but the idea is that you don't have to do things like icon the way I did transformance art once a month in Belfast. There's ways of doing it in a weekly context, a weekly format that's much more informal, but I think we covered that. Anyway, this week is decentering practices. And I'm going to not commit my cardinal sin of talking a lot of theory. I'm going to tell you the practice of it. I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story of how I set these practices up, maybe a few kind of thoughts, a few stories of what happened during those. And then I want you to ask me questions. I've got some questions already from people who have been emailing me, so I'm going to go through a few of those questions. And the idea is just kind of paint a picture of what these decentering practices are. Now, I developed 4. There's an infinite number of possible decentering practices. These are only the 4 that I came up with. I also had other ones that I didn't actually implement. See if I can remember any of those as we continue on. But, just telling you a little bit of the background, first of all, the decentering practices, before they were called decentering practices, before icon, before transformance art, before pyrotheology, when I was at university, the very first thing that I guess marked the beginning of my work was the Last Supper. I'd done stuff before that, a thing called the Siren Project. I might have mentioned a few other things, but the Last Supper was something that was particularly my own, and it was very, very simple, and most of you will know what it's about. I watched a movie from the 1980s called The Last Supper, which we should do for exposure, and Cameron Diaz was one of the stars of it, and it was basically a black comedy. And from what I can remember, it was a group of friends would invite someone over to their house, and somebody very kind of controversial, and if they didn't like what they said, they would poison the wine at the end of the meal and they'd die. Now, it started off as a mistake, an accident, and then it kind of became something they did. Anyway, I thought, this is a great idea, the Last Supper. So I thought what I wanted to do is get a space, invite 12 people, and then invite controversial figures to come and have a meal, sit round a meal, and kind of technically, if we didn't like what they said, it's their Last Supper, right? So that was the kind of playful twist on it. And I remember talking to a minister. He's a good guy, was very influential in Northern Ireland with a lot of young people, a guy called Steve Stockman. And he does some really interesting stuff in Northern Ireland, and he's a friend. But he said to me at the time, when I told him the idea, and I said, it'll probably be within the Christian community in the university, I'll kind of like try and draw them in. And he said, I think you're going to have trouble finding 12 people who will want to have their views challenged. So he had quite a pessimistic view of the whole thing, but I was like, no, I don't know. I think it'll work. So I set it up. And it worked. I ran the Last Supper on and off probably for 10 years in Northern Ireland. And every year it changed and chopped and changed. So I'm going to make it sound quite systematic how it runs. But I don't know if it ever ran as systematically as I'm about to describe. Like, it literally did start off as a meal and we invited somebody. I can't remember who our first guest was, but I think it was this priest called Pat Buckley, if I remember correctly, who's interesting because he's this gay priest who ordains gay priests himself. Now, that's technically not allowed, so I don't know who ordained him and made him a priest. And he was very kind of like controversial within Catholic circles, really interesting, lovely guy. I think he might have been our first guest, not 100% sure. But definitely one of our early guests. And and it was just a meal. It was like we all got together, we ate, we asked him to talk about himself and his life and what he did. We had a discussion, and it was just a fun evening. But the idea was this was a practice. And so I wanted to run it once a month. And the idea was one night will just be quite fun. But over the course of 5, 6, 7, 8, over 12, over a year, constantly having this kind of like antagonistic push and pull with interesting and controversial guests, it'll have a change, it'll have a positive transformation within our lives, that we will be decentered in a productive way. Obviously, I'm playing off the idea of centering practices with the idea of decentering practices. Psychoanalysis is a type of decentering practice because it's always a kind of helping you see a part of yourself that you hadn't seen, right? So in psychoanalysis, the analyst is always, in a way, listening to what you're saying and feeding it back so that you begin to hear things and see things about yourself that you would otherwise have missed. And in a similar way with the Last Supper, through these conversations, I wanted the guest to be a type of lens through which we could begin to see ourselves. And I can formalize that a little bit more now, and I can see what I was trying to do. And one of them was sometimes to ask the guest, what do we look like to you? So if we invited someone, say, from the Humanist Society and said, well, this is a group mostly made up of people who are within or have just recently left or have some sort of relationship with confessional Christianity. And so as part of the meal, what's your critique of us, right? So then you begin to see yourself through the other's eyes and begin to potentially see aspects about your own tradition that you might otherwise have missed. So that was an element of the Last Supper. But the way I formalize it, and as I say, in truth, it was a lot more fluid. And over the 12 years, we tried lots of configurations. But the basic idea was roughly 12 people, right? I kept it to 12 because, to be honest, it was hard at the time to get more than that. So by keeping it to 12, it sounds exclusive. But of course, if there were 15, you'd let 15 in, right? But you kind of roughly 12. The other thing, of course, being that you can basically just about have a conversation with 12 people. One is it's a lot of fun. So you would have a room, like the first place we met was a students' union room. So basic room with a kitchen, people coming in, maybe having a glass of wine, chatting, getting to know each other, just hanging out. So it's social, it's fun. That's a big thing for me. Is have fun with these things. Like, these things have to give you energy. They have to be enjoyable selfishly for you, right? And I love doing these things. So you have 12 or 15 interesting people coming together, chatting, getting to know each other. And then you have a long table, right? And symbolically, that notion of a long table. So there was many years where we had an upper room. I always like to kind of get as much of those symbolic connotations as possible. So my ideal is, an upper room, a long table, people are sitting chatting or standing chatting, then sit down. And there would be 3 courses. And the first course would be equivalent to the talk, where the person who was invited would give their position, maybe tell us a little bit about their life, and about where they're coming from, what they think. And so you would serve them first, right? So if you're serving starters, serve the guest first so that they can kind of eat quickly, and then serve everybody else. and then they kind of give their 15-20 minute kind of presentation. Then over the main course, that's a chance for Q&A back and forth, right? So maybe I would start that off with a couple of questions, and then other people would jump in, again serving the guest first so they can kind of get tucked into their meal. Because it was quite informal, it wasn't about them having to finish before they could talk. It was about eating and talking at the same time. And then dessert or coffee or tea would be a chance for like a broader discussion, where it would maybe the focus would be off the guest and the focus more would be on kind of the topic, and we would kind of talk back and forth. Now, sometimes, because I can't cook to save my life, right? I'm terrible at that. I have no interest in it. I don't know how anybody could enjoy it, right? So that was never something I was very good at. So when I was in charge, there were times where we just had sandwiches. I had a friend who had a sandwich shop. He'd bring in soup and sandwiches, and we do it very simply. And then there were times where there were people who love cooking, and they would kind of create some really nice meal. And other people would help out, and there'd be volunteers, all of that stuff. But people who love to cook, and I love to eat what people cook. So that's the great thing. But people who enjoy cooking and enjoy hosting, those were the best ones, right? Because you actually had a really nice meal. And then occasionally as well, there were times where we rented a restaurant and a place that would have a room separately, and people would just pay £15 or whatever a head, and you did it that way. So we did it each way. So one basic, their soup and sandwiches, 2-3 courses nicely prepared by somebody, or 3 actually going to a cafe, restaurant and booking. And each of them have a slightly different dynamic. If you're in a restaurant or a cafe, you have to work with the servers to make sure that they're not disturbing the flow of the conversation all the time. So that's very simple to do, but you maybe get people to order in advance of even going to the cafe. So they've got the list of what everybody wants. And there's maybe just, you ask them, can you just come in at these particular times to like get drinks orders? Or you get bottles of wine and soft drinks on the table so that you're not disturbed. So little things like that. But to be honest, again, see the messiness, don't worry. Everything I've done is very messy, and that can be part of the fun. But yes, but depending on which of those it is, you've got a little bit of logistics to work out. In terms of guests, how did I choose people? I mean, at first I would choose the people because I was starting it. And then when a community started to gather, then we all made those decisions. Somebody would go, oh, this would be an interesting person to invite. And we always try to get somebody who would bring an interesting perspective. It wasn't about trying to get the craziest person. It was because we wanted someone thoughtful, intelligent, interesting, and also coming from a position that might be different from many people in the room. And there was no shortage of people to ask. And the way I would contact them at the time was just send an email. Because I was part of the university, just a student, I would say, part of it's a university group, or it's a group loosely affiliated with the university. We'd love to invite you over. There's never any talk of payment, but there's people basically who are full-time ministers, full-time university lecturers, full-time politicians, and that's their job. So you contact them and you say, we've got 12 or 15 people, we'd love to hear what you have to say. Nobody ever said no. I didn't make a big deal of the Last Supper thing. I might have playfully mentioned it, but it was like, not a huge deal. And one thing I didn't do very often, but again, I'm systematizing it here, is if you do 12 gatherings, what I would recommend is, you map it out, 12 gatherings, and that you could see it in 3 sets of 4, right? So you could have 3 guests, and the 4th, no guest, where maybe you just have a meal and you talk about, your favorite and least favorite parts of the last 3 gatherings. And so that would mean 9 guests over a year. Not very hard to do. You could probably actually do that in an afternoon. Write down who you would like to get, contact them, get that set up. And also, sometimes it might be in-house. We did that very occasionally, hardly ever, but occasionally you might ask somebody who's one of the 12. How we picked the 12, we didn't pick the 12, we just sent word out, and then people would email, and kind of technically the first bunch who got back to us would be in. So we never really had much trouble, and we never had to turn anybody away, because even if it got to 16, 17 or 18, we would usually just kind of make it a slightly bigger event. But that was obviously before I had any profile. So it was, like now if I did something like that, I might get 100 people wanting to go, and I'd have to rethink how to do that. We had a couple of events that were bigger, and one we did where we had the 12, and then we had other people around the outside, and it kind of created this kind of like wider thing, but the 12 were the ones who were mostly asking the questions, and we opened it up wider. But anyway, what else? So that's the context, the types of guests. I'm going to look at some of the questions actually that were asked of me by a guy called Jay, who wrote to me. He said, who would you recommend inviting, both guest speakers and community and attendees? So yeah, you might want to keep it friends and colleagues. You might have more, you might want to be, if you're part of a church, put it out to the church group. Trying to keep it, as I say, to maybe 12 people. By the way, this is pre-streaming. Like these days you could stream it as well to your community. So you have the 12, and that might be quite interesting, where if it's well streamed, just a couple of iPhones, well positioned, or even just one iPhone and positioned well, good audio, and then people can join in from their home. Even write questions down in the chat box. That's a way of opening up to more people. But yeah, this could be a community of friends. Although I say ideally what's really fun is meeting new people and having fresh blood coming into the whole thing. I say like this is the great, especially after COVID for a year where we're all a bit lonely and haven't had a chance to interact with people. This is the perfect chance to try to do a Last Supper. People are dying to get out, hang out, have a meal together. And by the way, occasionally, like whenever we had somebody who was really into cooking, they would theme the meal on the actual topic. Just loosely, there would be maybe cocktails that somehow connected with the theme, and there would be food that would have been kind of almost paired, chosen, and so you can make a really nice thing of it. And it's only once a month, so you can make this into a kind of dinner club, a really interesting, beautiful dinner club. In terms of who do you invite, again, it's who would spark off a productive antagonism. Like who is interested. It's not always about who do I disagree with necessarily, but what position. Like the Humanist Society was a really good one that we did. There was a fundamentalist guy that we invited. He very fundamentalist, but a very nice guy, and we invited him. That was a really good one. We had this really great Marxist activist lecturer who lectured me. He was great, a guy called James Daly. We had politicians, but mostly it was like who would be quite fun and entertaining and provocative for us. So yeah, and you'll find lots of people out there. Are there things we should consider when asking a speaker? I wonder. I don't know if that means in terms of how to get them to say yes. What should you consider about in your email? I mean, as I say, because I was at university at the time, that was great. I could use the university, or maybe if you're part of a church, you can use the church banner, and you may be able to pay them a little bit. But you can, if you don't have any budget, you just say that straight up. Go like, this is, it's everyone just pays a little bit. We share a meal together. Maybe give them a little bit of money for their costs. But yeah, basically just go, we really want to engage with you. Really want to hear what you think. You'll probably find that most people say yes. As I say, there might be a way as well of making it even bigger, and have a podcast out of it, that kind of thing. A Last Supper podcast would be fascinating. Imagine having a meal and 12 people gathered, and it's well recorded, and you've got a podcast called The Last Supper. Could be a very good idea. Let's see, Oh yeah. Do you think this is for 1 year and then stop or keep going? Yeah, I like to think of it in terms of a year, just because, it can't. It's not going to be effective for people if you just do one off. You'll have a really good night, but if you say to people, and again, this is decide this yourselves, but it's quite good to maybe say to people, listen, we would like you, if you're going to be part of this, to commit for a year. And that doesn't mean commit to all of them. You might say commit to 9 in the year. And you give them a reason for that. Same as in psychoanalysis, you go like, you're not going to get much out of it if you just go once or twice, right? You got to like throw yourself into it. So you could make that a prerequisite. You could say, we're going to do this for a year. We want between 12 and 18 people, and we're going to ask you to commit to the entire year. And the reason for that is because this is a practice. It's also a social thing. It's a fun thing. You're going to enjoy it, but it is a practice that's designed to do something. And in order for it to do something, this kind of once a month is a minimum requirement. I would actually say that if you took it really seriously, but this would almost be if this is your job, you would maybe do once a month the Last Supper, and once a month you could do just a get together over drinks to discuss, because literally if you want it to have an effect, you kind of want it to be at the forefront of people's minds, right? So depending on, as I say, how much commitment you can give to this, you could even do it twice a month, but once a month is the main Last Supper, and then maybe 2 weeks time there's a little session where you all get together and you talk about the experience, right? But at the minimum, I think it's very good to say to people, like, do you want to commit for a year? Really commit to this. It's useful. And by the way, sometimes you need to say that because it's going to happen, right? If you put on a good event, they're going to want to come back. Right. In fact, that's the thing. Like, and I always judge my stuff by that. When I do an event, whether it's Wake or Spark or whatever, I'm going like, am I doing something that people literally get something out of, that they want to come back? That like they will, so a Last Supper event, if it works, everybody's going to be like, okay, where do I sign up for next month? How do you frame the supper? Do you tell the speaker that you want them to speak in anything specific? Yeah, basically we approach a speaker because they have a particular position or a particular topic of expertise, and ask them to talk about that. And I think I mentioned about the starter, the main course, and the dessert. That's a nice way to frame it. Say, we didn't always do that. It started off just a meal, and they talked, and then we had a discussion. But just neatening it up kind of can make it easier. We also had dinner manners, which I really liked. So a really good way of communicating what it's about in a playful way was we had like coasters with these dinner manners, and I actually found them. So I'm going to have a look. Where did I put the doc? This is really fun for me when I was going over this. So I would change these now. I'm going to read the ones that I've got, and I'll tell you why I'd probably change them. So we had 4 dinner manners. These were just printed out on pieces of paper, but if I was to do it again, I'd probably get coasters made up or placemats, because that's super cheap. You can get coasters, be really nice, get the design. If you're going to do it, take my design. I have a really beautiful design of the Last Supper. You have that on the front. On the back, you have the dinner manners. It's a lovely little thing for people to take home and remember the event. The 4 dinner manners were: 1, as all perspectives are valued, we'd encourage everyone to actively participate in the discussion, right? You'll notice there it's all positive. I hate anything that's negative. The do nots. It puts people's backs up. And again, because this is a dinner party, you want to kind of like not have rules. Like, for example, as all perspectives are valued, we'd encourage everyone to actively participate in the discussion, rather than saying something like "don't shut people down" or whatever it is. So it's positive, right? Second one, it says, because this is an open forum, all questions and comments are welcomed. Everyone is equal standing, and no one will be allowed to dominate the course of the evening. Right. So I might change that. No one will be allowed to dominate the course of the evening. I might tone that down if I was doing it again. But that was, but again, the positive of, this is an open forum, all questions, comments welcomed, everyone's equal standing. But maybe I would say, like, we'll all be mindful kind of to leave space for everybody, right? Something like that. The third was, as we seek to increase understanding and tolerance, we shall endeavour to refrain from aggressive behaviour. Okay, that was interesting. And number 4, don't eat with your mouth full. Right, so that was the 4th one, right? So I guess the reason for those dinner manners, all perspectives of value. So basically, the first one was like, listen, we want everyone to jump in. You don't have to, but we encourage everybody. If you've got a seat at the table, we want to hear from you. Second one, no one's going to dominate. This is not one person taking control. We're all equal standing. We're all at the table together. The third is, don't be an asshole. Right, and maybe I would say it like that. Go like, dinner manners, because like let's all try and be gracious with each other, and then of course just playfully, don't talk with your mouth full. Right, but that was nice, because even at the beginning, I would very rarely do this, especially once we had the group sorted and the DNA of the group sorted. You didn't have to say at the beginning how it ran, but of course at the early days, I would say, this is what it's about, this is what we're doing, give some ground rules. But the dinner manners on a little coaster is a really simple way of doing that. It's a really kind of simple way of getting the vibe across. By the way, it's so important, right? I'm enjoying this. This is like, I get excited about talking about how these things run. DNA is so important. I talked to a friend of mine who does group psychoanalysis, and he was talking about how it's so important to create a certain DNA within the group. And then once you've got it, literally every single person can leave that group over time and be replaced by other people, and still the same DNA remains. So there's almost like a culture is created, and the culture transcends the individuals. And so it's very key to create a type of culture of enjoyment and grace and excitement and anticipation, right? To kind of like, and a lot of that job, if you're the facilitator, that's you. You have to kind of show an openness with your gestures. You want to show a welcoming nature to everybody. You want to show excitement and anticipation. And so you kind of model out the DNA of the group. And if that's wrong, like if you have a few people early on who are very aggressive and kind of creates a very difficult environment, sometimes you just have to shut the whole thing down, start again. But you really be careful to try to set up, and that means probably at the beginning, making sure that there's a few people that you really trust in the group who'll help kind of create the environment that you want. People that have that right spirit, because they'll help set the culture of the event. And then when people come in, even if an argumentative person comes in, that's actually really exciting. A little bit of that's really, really good, but it won't derail everything, because there's a wider culture that you've cultivated. So that was the dinner manners. And what are the questions that you ask during that portion of the dinner? Everything was very wide open and wide ranging. I would often maybe start off just to kind of get the ball rolling in terms of questions and comments, and then you kind of see where it goes. But of course, as the facilitator, my job is to watch out for a few tendencies that happen. So some tendencies, the main ones, let me see if I can remember them, is splitting. So if you see kind of the group going into two halves, kind of the facilitator tries to break that down. By the way, mostly by just naming things. I'll come back to that in a second, actually. The other thing is two people dominating, where two people just are doing all the talking. Or maybe where small groups of what would you call it, binds between like 2 or 3 people who are kind of like against everybody else, right? There's these various dynamics that can happen in a group. They always happen in groups, And your job as a facilitator is just sometimes to name it without embarrassing anybody. But so you might go, for example, oh, it's interesting because it feels like this is split into kind of two positions. Why do you think that is? Right? Simple question. And then people start reflecting on it. It's like, oh, that's interesting because there's this group here and there's this group here, but it feels like we've kind of fallen into two kind of camps. You know, why do you think that is? So sometimes the facilitator just is watching what's going on and naming what's going on. You know, like again, naming and going, oh, you know, I've noticed that, you know, a few people over here, these guys are, you know, being quite quiet. I mean, that's totally fine, but is there anything you'd like to contribute? Again, you're kind of naming what's there, and in naming it, that can often be enough to break the dynamic open into something else. So that's the Last Supper. The basic keys again are upper room, long table, probably the 3 courses, someone who likes to cook, do all of that. Social environment at the beginning, social environment at the end, and actual event. Dinner manners, potential streaming, and it's that simple. It's that simple to do. And you can do it with a church, you could do it with your friends, you could just rent a place kind of close by and stick it in the paper, or like get word out on the street, and give it a try. And it's a lot of fun. I promise God, we had so much fun on it. It was absolutely fantastic. I can't remember a Last Supper that wasn't really fun. Right, that's that. I'll do the others a little bit quicker because I don't want to take up all your time, but after the Last Supper, which started before everything else, as I mentioned, and then kind of grew, the next one was probably Atheism for Lent. That's the one I'm going to say least about because it's the one that I run to this day. But it initially started by just reading this book called Suspicion and Faith by Merrill Westphal together, because it was subtitled Atheism for Lent, and it was a relatively orthodox Christian philosopher, but reading Nietzsche and Freud and others in a beautiful way, in a religious way, in a devotional way. And we read that book together over Lent. And then, of course, gradually I started to develop it and go, okay, actually, I want to do various readings. Instead of reading a book about these thinkers, I want to help people read these thinkers directly. And then finally, Atheism for Lent has become this, you get a reflection every day of Lent. And, it's quite intense as an experience. So you can either do Atheism for Lent with me every year, or you can take the material that I use and you can use it yourself and just run it yourself, or you can do it your own way. And by the way, again, before I fell on the final form, might not be the final form, let's say the current form, it started off as one book, then it went to a different thinker every week. So we take a week on Freud, and you'd have a few readings of Freud, a few readings of Nietzsche the next week. So you just did 4 different thinkers over the course of Lent, and then eventually it became a different thinker every day of Lent. And so you can, as I say, take my material and do it yourself. You can do it with me, but have your own group, or you can just go off and do it yourself. But the point of Atheism for Lent is to be decentered by the critics of the institution, the critics of God, the critics of religion, to allow it to be a productive decentering from people who are on the outside. Now, the truth is, Atheism for Lent, again, has evolved since the early days, because at the beginning, it was all about critique from the outside, right? So it was purposefully thinkers who are critiquing religion, not from within. So that whenever I did the Omega course, that was the critique of religion from those who are within. So I had Atheism for Lent, the critique from the outside, the Omega course, the critique from the inside. But Atheism for Lent has evolved to the point now where the critique is from inside and outside. So each week, first week it was critics from the outside of confessional religion, the second week critics from within confessional religion, the third week from outside, the fourth week from within. And so it's kind of like that's where it's got to now. So that's then after that, it was actually not the Omega course was next. The next one was the Evangelism Project. And I don't know where I came up with the idea, but I love the idea of going to be evangelized by other groups, to be decentered by the other, and again, to see yourself through the eyes of the other. And so once a month, I got a group together and we would go to different communities. We went to Scientology, we went to Hare Krishnas, we went to the Jewish community, the Islamic Society, the Humanist Society. We went to, we did things, what else? It's hard to remember now. We did another Hindu group, so various groups like that. And the idea was, we would learn, we'd listen, we'd sit down, go like, well, we're really interested in learning about, what it is to be Baha'i. We went to the Baha'i community. But then we would say, well, what's your critique of Christianity? Because it's mostly within the Christian tradition. But if it's not, you could say, what's your critique of, say, Western culture? Or what's your critique of this, X, Y, or Z? Whatever your group represents. And it was interesting to see a critique of yourself through the other's eyes. Because then you see something in yourself that you might not otherwise have seen. That we need the other's eyes in order to see ourselves. The other becomes an instrument of our further conversion. So the whole secret of the Evangelism Project is that we are evangelized deeper into our own tradition through a type of productive and enjoyable decentering. Right? And that ran for less time, but I still ran that for like 2 or 3 years. And it was a lot of fun. It was really enjoyable. And groups are always very open. Like if you write to a group and say, there's a group of us who would love to come and learn a little bit about what you believe and how you see the world. And then we would love to hear a critique of us. One of my favourite evangelism projects was when we went to the Free Presbyterian Church and we had a meeting with Ian Paisley, who was this very, very fiery fundamentalist politician, a little bit like your Pat Robinson or something like that. He got his PhD from that university, Oral Roberts, was it? Or it wasn't that one. But, but very conservative kind of background. And it was so much fun. He was a lovely guy, great laugh. And, we sat and we listened to him, and then we heard the great fundamentalist critique of ourselves. And well, yeah, actually, there's a lot in that critique that we need to listen to. So, lots of fun, the Evangelism Project. And by the way, all of these are great. I wanted to find things that sounded fun and provocative and interesting. So if you talk about the Evangelism Project, that's the kind of thing that can kind of really spark off interest in your community. If for example, you're a leader of a church, and you've got this group called the Evangelism Project where you go to be evangelized by other people, word's going to get out about that. That's going to be interesting to people. Or that you're doing atheism for Lent. Again, it's like it does so much of its own publicity. It's both provocative initially, but then when you hear the explanation, it kind of makes sense. And that's always the kind of thing that I'm trying to do, is to say something where initially you're like, what? And then you hear the explanation and you go, oh yeah, that makes total sense, right? So the Evangelism Project, I think, is a good example of that. It's like, you're going to be evangelized. And go, yeah, it's great, because we need the other's eyes to see ourselves. We need to see what other people are saying about ourselves, and we need to be evangelized. There are parts of us that lie in darkness, right? There's parts of us that need to see the light of day. We are being born again, and and you can help us be an instrument of our further conversion. And people like it, and conservatives like it more than liberals in my experience in the past. It was easier to get conservatives to these groups. We had a lot of YWAMers do them. And so then finally, the Omega course. The Omega course was a play on the Alpha course, right? So what it was is I got together a group of people. We would have some food together, we'd hang out, and we would do similar themes to the Alpha course. But whereas the Alpha course kind of had one... Now, by the way, you might not know what the Alpha course is, right? If you're American, it was massive in the UK, but basically it's an evangelism course. It's a course designed to introduce people to the basic tenets of Christianity, but more so to help them enter into an experience of conversion and into the life of Christianity. And The thing about it was very successful in many ways, but of course it had one position really. You went in and said, who is Jesus? But really there was one position on who Jesus was and what is the meaning of the crucifixion. And you would have a chat about it, but then you'd be presented with, inverted commas, the right answer, right? So the Omega course was slightly different. It was like, if Alpha was about your way in, then Omega is about your way out. At least your way out of a certain type of confessional Christianity. And so what the Omega course would do was it would take a subject like, the crucifixion, but instead of taking one position, it would offer a variety of positions and have a broader discussion without a conclusive answer. It was more about, well, what did you used to think about this? What do you currently think about it? Etc. And it was more about, Christianity is about being invited into this living conversation, not getting the right answer, but being kind of like drawn into and seduced by these questions, by finding yourself caught up in these concerns. And so we would, again, at the beginning, we used this resource called Living the Questions. It was this resource, I don't know if they're still around, but it was a good group, and they did these DVDs, and I think they were called Living the Questions, and we used a DVD called Saving Jesus, just as the little video to watch at the beginning to spark off some of the discussions. And we didn't use all their material, just little bits and pieces that kind of fitted with us. But they were a good bunch of people. But that's how it started. How the clean version that it evolved into is that you would have an honest conservative position, an honest liberal position, and an honest kind of radical outsider position. So you basically have two confessional positions and a non-confessional position on, say, the crucifixion. So N.T. Wright could be your conservative. So you say you want to get a good, honest conservative, N.T. Wright or G.K. Chesterton or Pannenberg or something like that. And then a more liberal position, you might get Bart Ehrman or Crossan or Tillich or Bultmann. And then maybe a radical position, you take some outsider like Altizer or Zizek or whatever, right? And the idea is over the week, you'd maybe get 3 very small readings or reflections that people, voluntary homework. They can go in and they can do a little bit of research on these 3 positions. Then in the Omega course, you would have the first half an hour would just be the facilitator going over 3 positions. And then the rest of it, another hour and a half or so, would be just discussing, more like, what did you used to think about this topic? Where are you now? How does it relate to you? And again, the idea is to not fall in some conclusion at the end, but to create a really enjoyable, enriching conversation. And at the end of the Omega course, you come out kind of like less with the idea that religion is about having the right answer and more with this more Jewish notion of this is about being part of a living tradition that we are kind of, that's been there before we were born and will be there after we're dead, that we are privileged enough to be a small part of. So those are the 4 decentering practices. Now I'm going to go and have a look to see if there are any questions. Here we go. Kevin says, maybe you could say the Last Supper is playing off the tension between the jouissance of wholeness and transgression. Do it enough and it gives way to the jouissance of non-rapport. Okay, that's very good. Okay. Yes. So let me try and unpack what I think you're talking about. Yeah. So the first of all, jouissance of wholeness, right? That's enjoyment of being right and being correct and being whole of the other, the guest, right? If you had an event, which in fact this is basically most events, where you invite the speakers who you agree with, right? That's a kind of jouissance of wholeness, right? The speaker is a reflection of you, your ideals and your desires. My interest, and by the way, I was telling about decentering practices I haven't done, but one of them I think I have done occasionally is conferences on a thinker that you don't agree with. So I did a whole 5-day event on C.S. Lewis. Where we listened to C.S. Lewis, where we did it, where he had his honeymoon with joy, with overlooking the forest that inspired Narnia. It was this beautiful C.S. Lewis 5-day event. But the idea was to allow C.S. Lewis to critique us, knowing that a lot of the people in the room don't fully agree with him or fully disagree with him. But the idea was to have it, instead of having a conference around a thinker that you agree with, what does it look like to have a conference around a thinker you don't agree with? But not to critique them, but to let them critique you, right? But what we usually do is we have events and conferences around thinkers who reflect our position. That's the jouissance of wholeness that Kev is talking about. Then you have, and that's not what the Last Supper is, obviously, because you're trying precisely to have guests who don't reflect and mirror back your position and your ideas, but rather kind of like cause you to kind of like almost cause an oscillation or a disturbance in your vision of yourself and in your beliefs. Then there's the jouissance, so the enjoyment of transgression. And that definitely plays more into the Last Supper. Like, one of the reasons why people go to the Last Supper sometimes is for the transgressive nature of it, right? Especially if you have some very controversial figures, which is kind of fun to do, right? To get actually properly controversial figures. There is an enjoyment of transgression, of going to the Last Supper. And that's probably how you get people hooked in. Because you're not going to get people hooked in by the enjoyment of wholeness, because you're literally saying to them, you're going to meet people you don't like. So you hook them in with the jouissance of transgression, go, you should do this, is a bit edgy, right? But yes, you ultimately want to move to beyond that, because that's not the right type of jouissance. And so Kev mentions the enjoyment of what's called non-rapport or non-relation, which is which I think, Kev, you're really onto something there. I haven't put it in those terms, but the Last Supper at its best then is not the enjoyment of someone you agree with. It's not the enjoyment of either a transgression that your parents wouldn't want you to be there, or your community, or even a transgression against the speaker where you get enjoyment out of disagreeing with the speaker, right? Which is a problem that can happen in something like the Last Supper, where someone gets enjoyment from being argumentative and defining themselves against. But the best type of event and the type of culture you want to cultivate is the enjoyment of non-relation, the enjoyment of conflict itself, not of disagreement, but of the productive dimension of the conversation itself. That's also key to the Omega Course. The Omega Course is you get this enjoyment of like not agreeing, but not because you define yourself against, but just the enjoyment of like different views and perspectives and the productive dimension of that within yourself. Because, and Kev's saying something very important here, is there has to be enjoyment. There has to be jouissance, right? That's one problem that a lot on the left have, is the only enjoyment is in resentment, right? There has to be enjoyment. The right are often better at hooking our enjoyment. There has to be something enjoyable about this. That's why, the Last Supper, you're having a meal. It's got, and the Omega Course, the Atheism, they all have to have a dimension of enjoyment, but the right type of enjoyment, not the enjoyment of we all think the same, not the enjoyment of we all have the same enemy or the same transgression, but the enjoyment of the conflict itself. So thank you, Kev. Paulo says, talk about the etiquette coasters. That's a nice. I didn't think of calling them the etiquette coasters. I think that's very good. Do you want me to talk about them, or is that what you're just saying that's what we should call them? Because that's very good. Let's see. Because all they had was those four. I'd say I would rewrite them a little bit. You write them yourself. Create your own kind of like, But they're going to be the giving people a sense of the culture. In a very similar, and it's a nice little memento for people to take away with them. I always like little mementos that people can take away. Kev says, Last Supper could be an easy practice for a church small group to take up. Absolutely. I've done it with, also I did like the Omega Course with a church small group that was actually trying to leave the church. They knew they were. Like, this was a group who were mostly on the edges of the church, but had once been very involved, like leaders high up. And they knew that they were kind of exiting, but they wanted to exit well and exit thoughtfully. And so I came along and I did a 12 weeks of an Amiga course with that group. And it was their way out. It was their exit. But what I loved about it was a very thought through exit. Like, they literally were like, we think we're on the way out, but we don't want to do this in some sort of stupid way or adolescent way or whatever. We want to do it in a thoughtful way and a respectful way. And so they invited me and said, listen, would you do the Amiga course with us? And we'll see where that goes. So that was another form of actually doing it in a small group that was moving out of confessional Christianity. And not that everybody in the group did, but there was a general movement in that direction. Chris says, bearing in mind that we don't make rules unless there's a problem, I wonder who it was who talked about their mouths full all the time. Yes. Are you insinuating that was me? That was potentially true. That's a very good point, by the way, Chris. I always said that about Icon. Whenever we talked about rules, I've got, don't make rules. Rules are the kind of thing that come up when a problem arises. Yeah, like, and if you try to anticipate all the problems that arise, you'll have a list of 500 rules. But yeah, you're absolutely right, Chris. There's something about kind of like you do something and then a problem comes up and you're like, oh, right, we kind of have to address that. And then maybe you kind of, something comes up. So yeah, I have the same, I think that's a very insightful comment. Oh yeah, GS says, I like what I'm hearing. This is so doable. It is. I thank you for saying that. Like, the funny thing is, I forget because I was doing it, and then I get so caught up in theory and philosophy, it starts to sound magical and big. Like, these things sound like a kind of something grandiose. Like, anything, I suppose, sounds hard when you don't know how to do it. But these are actually super simple. Like, super simple. So even whenever I get emails, about, do you have any literature on how to do a Last Supper? It's kind of like going like, to have a meal. Like, it's really actually, all of them are really doable. And I want to take the magic out of it and just go like, yeah, this is like, I've told you 4 of them in an hour, and I've basically given you all the information you need and some information you don't. Oh yeah, Kev is quoting somebody, I think, says, it takes 10 years to change your mind. That's one thing these practices do is allow the other to plant seeds in your mind that may take root and change over time. 100%. I really believe in these decentering practices, and I kind of let it go. When I came to America, I let them go a little bit because I didn't have a community here. But I think these are important. And it's not necessarily the 4 that I've mentioned, but the very idea of decentering practices, of seeing the other as exposing our own otherness and opening us up to something, I think is vital. And so often we do the opposite. So many practices, and they're not bad, but a lot of practices are designed to, obviously bring calm and to people when we are anxious, etc., etc. They're all very good, but a controlled form of anxiety is quite useful. Like in psychoanalysis, without any anxiety, you can't do it. That's why you can't do analysis with someone who's in love, right? Because they're in love and they're not anxious and they're whatever, so you kind of go away, come back in a few years, right? But you also can't do it if the anxiety is too high. Like, there has to be a productive level of discontent. And decentering practices are all about trying to find that productive level of discontent. That's why they're fun, as in a meal, wine, food, good company. They all calm you down. And then throw in a crazy guest, and that kind of like ramps it up, and you're trying to find, like, you're an artist trying to find that perfect level of discontent. Heather says, with the Evangelism Project, did the group get together after the experience to discuss it? Yeah, what we often did is afterwards we'd go for coffee at a coffee shop and just talk about it in the direct aftermath of going to the group. If I were to do it now, I would probably think about having that maybe the next week or something like that. I mean, yeah, so Yeah, that's what we did. We just generally went and then afterwards had coffee and had a conversation. But I think it would be very useful if you were doing it once a month to then, yeah, maybe the week after to have like, even if it was a Zoom call just for people to, or even the day after probably while it's really fresh in people's minds, to kind of like talk about their experience. I think that's very, very helpful. But yeah, we just did it straight afterwards, but I think it would be a better idea probably to do it the next day. Oh yeah, Chris says living the questions are definitely still around. Yeah, they were really good. I'm actually developing resources at the moment for an Amiga course. I was doing it a few months ago. I got quite far in it, and then I've put it to bed, but I want to get back to it. But that was the resources that was most useful to me. The only thing being, it wasn't perfectly designed for the Amiga course, because what I really want is they had really good kind of progressive thinkers. But what I really want is I want three positions. And here's the ultimate idea for the Amiga course is you run it every year and you can slot out and slot in different thinkers, right? So it's not, 1 year you use N.T. Wright, the next year you use G.K. Chesterton for maybe your more orthodox, and 1 year it's Bultmann, the next year it's Tillich or whatever for your liberal one. So I kind of go like, once it's well designed, and I've got to design it well, but that's one thing, by the way, is it gets easier when it gets clearer. Like these did start off messy, and then it got clearer and clearer. So my Amiga course plan is to have it all listed out, all the topics, and 3 people, and I'll maybe offer people 6 or 7 different ones they can choose to slot in, plus anybody you want. So it's just like, if I create the resource, you'll get it and you'll go, okay, here's stuff that I don't have to go looking for things. But actually, if I want to create my own Amiga course, all I have to do is go, who's a good, honest conservative? Who's a good, honest liberal? Who's a good, honest kind of radical? And it might even be your friends, people you know, and you invite them to come in and do the Amiga course. So I think that's where it's kind of cleaning up. And living the questions could be the resources for the good progressive. So Kev saying, the Alpha and Amiga course, first month you do an Alpha course for N.T. Wright, second month you give Cross and control of the Alpha course, third month it is Altizer's Alpha course, fourth is the Amiga. That's interesting. Yeah, I think that's a good progression, to be honest. But actually, in terms of a week, right, taken seriously, what you're saying is like N.T. Wright, Cross and Altizer would be a great week. If you were looking at, say, the crucifixion, and someone would just go, so midweek you would get maybe a YouTube video of N.T. Wright, you'd get a little excerpt of a reading from, say, Altizer, and you would get a podcast with Crossan. So that's your homework for the week. And then you go to the Amiga course, and then the facilitator doesn't have to do very much. They maybe just kind of like, mention the 3 positions and then open it up for a discussion. Kev says, could you spin a centering practice, centering prayer, mindfulness meditation, into a decentering practice by inviting someone who is suspicious of meditation and centering practices into it? Yeah, it probably wouldn't be very welcome, mind you, but can like mindfulness... I felt a bit like that one time recently. I went to some friends of mine had this kind of like a spiritual day, and I was invited along, and I was there, and I was definitely the odd one out. And I was very respectful. I was enjoying it. I actually really enjoyed it, but I couldn't enter into it to the same enthusiasm as the others. So I probably was that decentering experience you're talking about, but. And I don't think I was unwelcome. I think it was fine. We're all friends, but I did feel I was probably taken away from the experience slightly, because there was someone there, a kind of a shaman type, who at the beginning gave like an hour-long lecture and then kind of entered into these practices. And I definitely was the one who was nodding my head least and probably asking the most questions. So I don't know. if that. And the other thing is, by the way, mindfulness not like great. It's like this is not, as you know, as you're not saying, but like it's not in a sense going like we need to get rid of centering for decentering. In a way, you can't have decentering without centering practices. We all mindfulness, centered prayer, you know, can be very, very beneficial. It almost feels that you kind of probably need them both. But they're very different. But we need a little bit of both in our lives, I guess. In the self-help world, there is the master practice. A group gets together to challenge and advise each other towards success. Is the decentering group a perverted mastermind? I've never heard of that practice. So in the self-help world, there's a mastermind practice, right? And that's where a group gets together to challenge and advise each other towards success. Is a decentering group a perverted mastermind? Yeah, I like the way you frame that, because this is about challenging and advising, but not towards success. In fact, a lot of the decentering practices, one of the differences between counseling and psychoanalysis is a lot of counseling or life coaching or self-help is about optimizing you, right? So you hear this term optimization, or, you know, kind of like hacking, life hacking, or to make you more productive. Psychoanalysis is kind of the opposite in a way. It's kind of makes you less productive, less optimized. You kind of enjoy your non-productivity, or in the sense that we don't want to just be better kind of machines of consumption, and kind of like, you know, there's something we need to stop. So perverted mastermind, I think, is kind of right, because this is not about going to the Last Supper to be smarter or better at what you do or anything like that. In a way, it's to confront you in your tracks, to see something and tarry with something that you might otherwise have missed. So yeah, I like where you're going with that. I have to think about it a bit more, but I like where you're going with that. And last question from Heather. Thank you, Heather. Let's see. Do you find culture factors in? I'm sure, having lived in both Ireland and the US, you've noticed that Americans are less comfortable with conversations where everyone doesn't agree. Ideas. Yeah, I mean, be honest with you, but to greater or lesser extents, all of us kind of find it hard to kind of like be confronted with difference. But you are right, like some cultures maybe have cultivated better practices for that. So yeah, there are different cultural practices that can be kind of useful. And there are times of high stress whenever difference can't be tolerated as much. And I think it's more like, I love America. I've lived here on and off for probably 12 years now, so I'm a huge fan. And I've noticed so much of the cultural differences. It's such a big country, such a massive country, that the East Coast, where I lived for a while, is so different from the West Coast, which is so different from a lot of what you find in the middle. So, but in times of high stress, people often break into kind of the splitting defense of good and bad. And I think there's a lot of stress with a number of factors at the moment that are causing that kind of split defense. And it's about getting around that, right? How do you get around it? That's why I'm always trying to find playful ways of doing it. Like what Kierkegaard calls indirect communication, kind of going like trying to very subtly find those ways through comedy and storytelling. Parables are a great way to try to kind of like weaken that defense mechanism. So you're absolutely right. I think across the world at the moment, back home, I gotta say, I wish I could say Ireland's better at it. I don't think we are. Across the world, there's a lot of tensions, and we need to learn how to have conflict. We need to know how to navigate that. How do you do it culturally? Cultural sensitivity, you're absolutely right. How you do it in Ireland is different from how you do it in America, how you do it in England. And that's the art. We could talk about it for a while, but the core is knowing your community and knowing that, remember I mentioned that idea of getting the right level of discombobulation, right? That's the right level of disquiet, the right level of anxiety, and where it's enjoyable. If you do something, you throw people into something that's very aggressive, no one wants that, right? If you give everybody just what they want to hear, it's boring. It's like, where is that place? And that's the art. That's the art of choosing who you invite to the Last Supper. That's the art of who you put into Atheism for Lent, or who you put into the Omega course, or who you go to with the Evangelism Project. It's about going like, where's the right level of disquiet, of decentering, that's not too much or too little. The Goldilocks effect. Where's the Goldilocks effect? But it's the opposite of just right. It's the just wrong, right? So you're looking for the anti-Goldilocks effect. That where is the just wrong enough that things work? All right, listen, thanks so much for listening to me tell my stories about the decentering practices, and I really do want to encourage you to give it a blast. And if you are doing it and you want my support, where I can tell people that, this is a group that's meeting in, Alabama or wherever, then, contact me and let me know what you're doing, and I can maybe, tweet about it and try and let people know, and see if we can get a few of these decentering practices up and running in a post-COVID age. This is the right moment, because we're about to hopefully start to reopen, fingers crossed, and if things start to reopen, there are so many people are going, I will love to go for a meal and hang out with people. I'd love to try some of these things. So good luck. Thank you for being part of this, and I will talk to you again very soon. Bye-bye.